Lan Samantha Chang's novel, The Family Chow, was one of the first books the author selection committee considered for this year's festival. The story engendered a lot of discussion and debate, which is a good sign. We were thrilled when Chang accepted our invitation to speak at today's festival. Not only has she written 3 novels and had her work translated into 9 languages, but she is also the current director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, the preeminent creative writing program in the country. A recipient of numerous fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin, with an education from Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Yes, you heard me correctly. True, right? Yeah. Chang is the first woman and the first Asian American to direct the Iowa program. Serendipitously, one of today's debut authors, Belinda Chang, is a graduate of Iowa and one of her students. The Family Chow is a tale of family, brothers, Chinese food, immigration, internalized racism, and murder. If you have read The Brothers Karamazov, because after all, who hasn't, right? You will see echoes of the Russian brothers in Chang's story of 3 Chinese-American brothers who grew up in Middle America and whose father owns the only Chinese restaurant in town, aptly named Fine Chow. The food is great, but the father is not what he seems to be. Their mother has retreated to a Buddhist convent. There is contention over a jade ring, and the family dog is missing. Then there is a murder. At times funny, at times poignant, always complex, and quite suspenseful, The Family Chow is a worthy read. You will enjoy reading the book. You can buy it in the lobby, and hearing Sam Chang right now. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for that great introduction. And it's just a real pleasure to be here and such an honor to be here. Okay, I have to say something about rats, which seems to be the... We are a family that has had many rats as pets. They're really wonderful pets. They're sweet and smart. Ours were named, I'll think of them now, Annie and Lucy, Lily, Bella, and Rowena. Yeah, so I just felt like I needed to mention Annie, Lucy, Lily, Bella, and Rowena because rats have been brought up, and I'm very fond of them. Kind of love rats. Okay. Okay. I was invited to discuss my journey as a writer, and I made a lot of notes. But I've been thinking about it during this morning and last night, and I'm considering kind of deviating from some of my notes. So if my conversation becomes somewhat of a digression, please forgive me. You know, it's really interesting to me. There's a story that I've told since I was really young about how I became a writer, but at this point, I feel like there's a change in the way I see the whole thing, and so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that. This is the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors, and there's a pen that sort of comes off the word authors, and it's just really empowering to see that. And I was thinking today of my journey as a writer in some ways as a journey toward a kind of authority, you know, because authors have authority over what I have to say, you know, over the stories that matter to me and over my own ability to tell these stories, which, as I will try to describe to you, was somewhat truncated when I was a kid. So I was born and grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin. Yeah, giggle. Famous town because it was the birthplace of Eric Weiss, or the supposed birthplace of Eric Weiss, aka Harry Houdini. It was also the birthplace of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Yeah, and where he was buried. And hundreds of people still come to his grave every year. And it was the birthplace of Edna Ferber, the American author who wrote Showboat and So Big and Giant. Do y'all remember these books? Yeah, so, there was kind of a mixed story about Appleton growing up. My family, my parents, who have, passed away in the last decade in Appleton, came to Appleton in the year I was born, and I was the first child that was born there, but I have two older sisters and one younger sister, and my parents basically were born in China. They were born during wartime. They grew up during wartime. They went through really complicated and devastating events as youths, and they made a sort of long route to the United States, arriving in the 50s as part of a scholarship program, in my mother's case, that was designed to combat communism. My mom and dad were, I think, profoundly intelligent, thoughtful people who really, truly wanted all of their children, daughters, to be doctors. Read to be safe. I think now that I'm a parent, I understand the desire to have one's child be able to survive no matter what the circumstances. And I remember this story from when I was a small girl, my mother telling me, if you are a doctor, you will never go without, because even the most horrible and the people in power, or even if there's a war and nobody has any money, galloping inflation, which they'd lived through, and all of these things, you will have enough to eat. And that was their intention for all of us. But what they didn't understand is that they had given birth to these 3 and then 4 people with this prodigious energy and incredible sense of willfulness. And all of us are just, profoundly strong-willed people. And so we were stuck in this little ranch house in Appleton, Wisconsin. There were 3 bedrooms. My parents got one. My big sister got one. Sometimes my grandmother, my mother's mother, would live with us for, years at a time. And so the sisters, 3, we were crammed into bedrooms together. And I did not have my own room until one of my sisters left for college. I guess until I was almost 18. The thing is I grew up in this intense hierarchy of sisters, where I was the 3rd sister, and I was the sister who said yes to my 2 older sisters, who are the incredibly, incredibly powerful human beings. I mean, I thought about talking about each of them individually, but it would take too long. But basically, I was told by them what to do, and I had no power in this situation at all. And what happened to me as the 3rd out of 4 was I became an observer. I became the sister who was always saying yes, but thinking secretly, no. I have my own thoughts. I have my own story. I have my own perspective. And, it was kind of a really interesting place for a writer to grow up, a birth order-wise. Like when I was growing up, I noticed there were 2 famous authors who were from families of 4 sisters, Louisa May Alcott and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Both of them were the 2nd sister out of 4, but I was the 3rd. Beth died and Carrie was very weak. I don't know if you remember these, I was those in that position, but I was always secretly planning some kind of revolt that I didn't even understand at the time. We were growing up in a family where my parents were super busy, and they were native Chinese Mandarin speakers, and somehow in there they forgot to do various language-oriented activities with us. So the first time I remember being read a story was after begging my dad to read me a story, and he read me this children's book. I'm sure he chose the smallest one that we had. It was called Rabbit and Skunk and the Scary Rock, and I was obsessed instantly. I mean, it was instant. I found paper, I found a pencil, and I started copying the pictures from Rabbit and Skunk and the Scary Rock out, and I started writing the letters for all the words, including the serifs, even though I'd never really looked at letters before. I'd never seen them before. It was this obsession. I could tell that the book contained some secret world, like some outside world, something that I could enjoy privately, that there was an entire method of conveyance in the object of the book that was going to tell me the truth. It was going to tell me what the world was like outside of my family. It was going to give me, message somehow about who I was, what the world was like, what would become of us all. And I just knew at that moment that I wanted to make books. I wanted to be a writer. I was 4 years old, and it really has never changed for me. I will give my sister Tina a lot of credit, even though she drove me crazy in so many ways, in that she read to me basically for a couple of years until I was 7 and I could read myself. I remember she wrote for me a note to my kindergarten teacher saying, "Please teach Sam to read," because she knew I wanted to learn to read. And my kindergarten teacher at the time, people believed that you weren't supposed to learn to read until you were 6. Do you remember this? Until first grade. It was like a whole thing. Now it's the opposite, but at the time, so she did not teach me how to read because she wanted me to enjoy the world without reading, which I now realize was a gift. But I remember my first day of first grade, I remember learning my first 2 words, red and blue, which is odd now that I think of it, why those 2 words? But I remember just racing through everything I was given and just ravenously learning it. And I just think it had something to do with 2 things: being a kid in a big family where basically I didn't have to, the attention was not paid to me because my 2 older sisters were super good at soaking up my parents' attention. And also where I also secretly felt that there must be some kind of world other than the world that was being told to me was existing. So it was just a way of getting out of the house. It was because we were very contained. We were the first Chinese family in our town. It was a way of getting out of the house. It was a way of getting out of Appleton. It was just a way of understanding the world, and crucial survival, secrets. Everything best was in books. And I read pretty much nonstop for for many years. And I also wrote copiously until at some point I suddenly realized how difficult it was. That writing is actually, that putting something down on the page truthfully is extraordinarily difficult. And I stopped. Because it was as if I'd hit a bump and realized that what I was tackling was not, something fun, but something monumental and powerful and important. And I didn't know how to move on, how to go forward with that. And hitting a bump, sort of starting off and then hitting a bump has been, for me, a regular experience in my writing life. What happens to me is I'll get some work done and I'll feel like I know where I'm going, and then suddenly I hit a bump and I can't write. And I think for me, it seems to have something to do with this idea of authority, of my world expanding and suddenly wanting to write about a bigger world than the world that I had previously managed to convey in my work. And so, it's something that I always struggle with. I always, it's a period during which I should not make impulsive decisions. And then I just sit and wait. And then eventually, if I wait long enough and I sort of absorb enough and think enough, another project will come to me, or a new place in my writing will come to me, and I'll keep going. So basically, we lived in a town in the 60s and early 70s that had no Chinese food in any way. And so food became a major, major deal and theme for me in my work. As I think my first book's title was Hunger, a Novella and Stories. I published it 25 years ago, and Hunger is going to be reissued in a 25th anniversary edition this year. Thanks. But food was a big deal to us because my parents arrived in Appleton and discovered that there was no place in town that sold soy sauce. There were no scallions. There was really very little that they could see as food or identify as food. And for those of you who are immigrants in a strange land, food is one of the ways you become, yourself at the end of the day. Like eating and making a meal is a way of having an identity, or, acknowledging your heritage, the people you love, who you are, your body. It was a huge deal. So my parents they basically invented they had what I think of as a Chinese test kitchen in our house. And they would take ingredients. First, they made a trip to Chicago. They would fill the whole station wagon with food, bring it home, because that was 4 hours, and 3.5 hours. And they would eat up all the perishables, and we would have a few weeks of sort of glorious bok choy meals and various things, Napa cabbages and scallions and the kinds of things the kinds of foods that my parents grew up with. And then they would start working on the non-perishables. So we would have a few months where they would eke out our supply of dried mushrooms and dried various other foods and soy sauce and things that came in cans and jars and bottles. And they would do things like stir fry whatever was at hand in the Red Owl grocery store. So it was iceberg lettuce, stir-fried iceberg lettuce. So seriously remember having that as a child. And the recipes that I grew up learning to cook are sort of mixed versions of Chinese and American food. And actually, I wrote an article for Food and Wine in which some of the recipes are actually printed. People have written to me about them. Substitute spaghetti for these noodles. Substitute, you know what I'm saying? It was kind of a fascinating thing. And my parents, having tested the food out on us, started to invite their American friends into the house to test out the food on their friends. And they made a list. My mom showed it to me in her recipe file, what Americans like, and then what Americans don't like. And you won't be surprised to know that Americans like beef. That was one of the things on my mom's list. Americans do not like tripe. So it was very much sort of an attempt to what I now see as assimilation. I now see my work as kind of a catalog of long-term assimilation. So that in my most recent book, The Family Chow, first of all, it's set at a restaurant where food is a big deal. And the major, it was started in 2003. I made a note in my log that said, the story takes place in one night. It is a huge dinner party. I wanted, and actually in the middle of my book, The Family Chow, there's a massive dinner party that takes place in one night, and it's probably the most important scene in the book because something happens afterwards and during. But I felt that the food, you know, the fact of writing about food and including food in my work began to mean a great deal to me, I think, based on the experiences that my parents had. In the family Chow, the restaurant family also has 3 children. They're not girls, although I thought about it. I thought it would, but then I realized that it was just too close to life and I couldn't handle it. 3 boys. And each of them their association with food is very much related to where they are in the arc of their parents' long-term assimilation to the United States. So the oldest son, Dago, is sort of like a kind of loves cooking food. He considers himself an artist. Food is precious to him and important, and it's all about how he expresses himself. And I feel that this is related to the parents' heritage when they first arrived in the country and food meant so much to them. Whereas the middle child, Ming, who's got a lot of issues, I mean, as a middle child, I feel I can say this, a lot of middle child issues, he rejects his family's food. He rejects Asian food in any way, and he moves to New York, and he plans to get rich and eschew his parents' culture. And one of the scenes in the book, I think, that is most meaningful to me is when he starts to eat Chinese food again toward the end of the book. And then the youngest child, James, is just, he doesn't remember how to, what Chinese he learned as a child. He was brought up in a very Americanized situation by his older brothers, and he's just trying to get along and be a good child. And he sort of understands, he appreciates what he's eating, but he does not make any effort to learn to cook or do anything particular to it. Anyway, as I grew up and became more aware of my desire to write, I'm just moving back in time, my desire to write, my parents started to suddenly realize that all along I'd been kind of secretly rebelling against them. That I didn't really want to be a doctor. And I don't know how they could tell because because my essay to college literally said I want to be a dermatologist because I once had a rash. It was like my choice, the only one I knew. My parents could tell that, and I think they knew, especially my father, who was this extremely charismatic and tyrannical man, if those of you who read my book can't imagine. He knew I didn't want to be a doctor, and he was always trying to suss me out about what was really going on, and I was always sort of obfuscating and pretending that everything was the way they wanted it to, but secretly, I realized that I really needed to write. It wasn't simply a question of rebelling against them or not wanting to take chemistry, although those things were true. But it was simply that writing was somehow, as a child, fused into my sense of self, and that it became so important to me that in order to be myself, I had to finish. I had to finish my story. To finish. Okay. Doesn't this thing go off and start beeping? No?
Apparently not.
Okay. All right. I'm done.
Besides the obvious homonym with food, chow, we add an S and you have chaos. How deliberate was this play on words?
It was completely deliberate. I grew up in a family of chaos. I mean, I cannot believe now, like, that we all fit into this space.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Your novel is very funny, and it's suspenseful, it's a mystery, and it's moving. As a writer, how do you mix all these elements into one story?
Oh, that's so, there's this issue about tone as a writer. Tone is the narrator's attitude toward what they're writing about. And it's very hard to have a tone that's like big and capacious. And what I was about to sort of like eventually launch into after 45 minutes was the idea that as I got older, my sense of what I could write about and what I had authority over, it grew. It grew and it grew. And then the tone of my first works were, like my first book was like super low key and sad and small. And all of the characters were young women between the ages of like 13 and 23. And then as I just became older and moved into the world and read more and did more and saw more things, I was able to expand the tone so that it was able to be funny and violent and, you know, all those other things.
Good. Natural progression for you, sounds
well,
like.
I mean, there were these horrible stops and starts.
Would you share your reaction to how it felt when you became the first Asian American and female to head the Iowa Writers' Workshop?
Oh, it's funny because a lot of people told me I wouldn't get the job. One of my friends had coffee with me, and I was saying something like, well, if I get the job, blah, blah. And she said, Sam, you know they're not going to give you that job.
Wow.
I know, because all of the other finalists were men. And it's so hard to describe what the environment was like for women writers, but especially women writers of color back in the early 90s, mid-90s, late 90s when I was coming up. I just can't even describe what it was like. I could use numbers. My first year at Iowa, there were 8 women in a class of 28.
Wow.
And I mean, things like I had these great male teachers, but none of them would blurb my book. It was strange. I mean, if you wrote about sex, they would blurb your book. But it took me a while to work up the authority to do that. That happened in my first novel, my second book.
So what'd you say to your friend when you got the job?
What did my family say?
What did you say to your friend who said you weren't going to get it?
I didn't say anything.
And did your family forgive you for not being a doctor?
That was the first time my parents were ever relaxed about my life, was when I got this job. Because there's this Chinese newspaper that they distribute in America, and we were profiled in the newspaper, and all of a sudden my parents were okay with me doing this. But I was 40.
They knew that you would be able to eat, apparently.
Yeah, they knew we'd be able to eat.
Right. So following that, how do you write a novel, or several, while directing the Writers' Workshop and teaching?
Okay. No, so this is it was a bad problem for me, and it reached a point where I thought that I would have to. It was after my mother died. It was in 2014. And I had published my most recent book in 2010 and had been completely unable to write after that, which is normal for me. But I didn't have the energy to start up because work was so bad. My mom died. And, you know, my mom was a secret supporter of my writing in that she told me officially that she didn't want me to be a writer, but I always had this feeling that she was secretly supporting me. My coworker said that after your parents die, or if a parent dies, people sometimes have this moment of extraordinary clarity where they can see everything. And my question was, how long does that last? And she said, not that long, maybe a week. But for some people, some people it lasts a long time. And I realized that writing was the most important thing, that if I couldn't do it, I would have to quit my job, and that I do love my job. You know, that there are things about it that matter to me. It matters to me to be able to make the program more diverse, to bring in more women, more people of color, and thanks. And speaking of speculative work, I mean, we now have a lot of speculative writers in our program, and we didn't when I was starting out. It was considered, I don't know what. Anyway, so yeah, I just made up my mind that I had to do it, and I had to figure out how to do it, and that meant sort of changing my attitude toward work, where everything used to really upset me. And there are a lot of things to upset you when you run a program in a red state where like people are writing about all kinds of things, queerness, people are telling stories that are not acceptable to the government, and yet you are heading this program and you're determined to go in a certain direction. It's all really complex. Anyway, everything used to upset me, and then I just realized that I had to just, I don't know, like get less upset, and which is harder to do, obviously, than it sounds. And then to sort of give myself places to go so that I could get work done and get away from everything. And this is where my husband came in. He and my daughter spent a lot of time by themselves when I was writing The Family Chow. Like every 6 months, maybe a few weeks, they were by themselves. And actually, the best thing about it is that they developed this great relationship. And they have a lot of jokes, and it's a really special thing for them. And I'm so glad I was gone. Well, yeah, for a lot of reasons. I mean, but I was able to work when I wasn't home. I was able to go to places like Hedgebrook or Yaddo or Ragdale, places where you can go and people treat you like an artist. I mean, one of the fascinating things about being director of an arts program is it seems like a big deal job, but nobody treats you like an artist. You are the director of the program, and the artists want you to make it safe for them. And that's your job, is making it possible for everyone else to get work done. So yeah, it's been a real struggle, and I'm still, because I'm in between projects now, I'm in one of those points where I'm like, why am I doing this? But whatever, I know it's important, and I'll keep doing it for as long as I'm able to do it.
I want you to know that I was able to observe Sam as we were walking in this morning, FaceTiming her daughter as she's planning to grace us with her presence. Her daughter is in a concert today playing violin.
Yeah, she's
and
a soloist.
She's missing it, so she could be here with us today. So she's juggling.
Thanks.
So here's the next book question.
Yes.
What are you working on?
Oh, I just finished a short story. I can say that. And I actually really like it. It was something I'd been working on off and on for years and couldn't figure out whether the two main characters were going to have sex. I mean, it seems like a big problem, right? Like, why did, and then I realized that no, they're not. But the minute that happened, I was able to finish the story, and I actually really love it. And so I did that. And the big thing I'm waiting for is to figure out what I'm going to write next, which is always horrible for me.
Okay, well, we want to thank you, and at lunch you can finish up.
Thanks.
Video.